This online lecture is a tutorial on the Venetian style. It's a short tutorial, just a couple of images that I hope will help you with your chapter 14 reading. At the end of chapter 14 there's a section called Developments in Venice, and this Venetian style was the primary development that we see in this region of Italy during this time period. Now it's interesting because in many ways the Venetian style, depending on which art historian you talk to, coexisted during the waning years of the High Renaissance. And so it's interesting because you're seeing actually a very different approach to painting in comparison to the images that we studied when we were looking at High Renaissance images that were coming out of Florence primarily. Now there's a few things that make the Venetian style different from the other Italian High Renaissance paintings that we looked at in class. And I'm going to go ahead and break down these what I see as the three main components of this style that are important to remember. First of all, one of the things that we see with the Venetian style is a more widespread adoption of the medium of oil paint. So we know that in other regions of Italy in the High Renaissance, primarily they are using fresco paint. And we know that in Northern Europe, in the High Renaissance as well as the early Renaissance, they were primarily using oil on panel. What the Venetian style begins to use is they begin to use oil, but they begin to put the oil paint onto canvas. And this is really significant because oil on canvas is one of the more typical painting media that more modern and contemporary artists use today. So an extremely important development in pairing up materials that still, as we see, is being used today. Because they work with oil, we see a change in the treatment of color. With the majority of High Renaissance Italian painting, the color is relatively muted. And part of this is stylistic, and part of it does come from some of the color restrictions that come primarily with using fresco paint. Now with the Venetian style, the color use is much more richer in appearance. And this is certainly a point of difference between Venetian style and other forms of Italian painting during this time period. So color is number one. Number two, as being most important, is this idea of sensuality. And this sensuality is not just a sexual sensuality. And you can look at this image and you can see that there are some sexual aspects to it. It's not just the sexual sensuality, but it's also a visual sensuality. That these paintings are just really nice to look at. They're luxurious, they're warm, and they have that very just sensual quality to them. So number two, sensuality, in both subject matter as well as in the visual effects of the painting. And then the third feature of the style that's important for us to remember is ambiguity. It's very difficult in your typical Venetian painting to really understand what's going on. And it's not so much as with Northern European painting, where it's more so because they're using a lot of symbolism. It's just the image and what the artist chooses to put in the image is a little bit unclear, and as I said, a little bit ambiguous. And even if you look at this painting here, you can kind of get an idea of what it's about, but not totally an idea. Who is this lady? Why is she sleeping naked in the middle of this landscape? Where is this landscape? And there's many more questions I'm sure you could pose when you're looking at this image. So now that we've talked about the style of the Venetian style, let's take a look at some features. More particular to this particular work of art we see here, Sleeping Venus, by the artist Giorgione. Now in this image, we see this nude woman who's, luxuriously laying out, displaying her nude body to the viewer, and she is sleeping. Now, we're seeing with this presentation of the female in this way, a theme that's somewhat common in art at this time, and has historical precedence, which I'll show you in a moment. This theme is Venus Pudica, which is basically a woman who is trying to make an attempt at being modest. And this attempt is usually half-hearted, and it really doesn't fool anyone. There really is not a lot of modesty going on. I feel like she could be a little bit more covered up if she wanted to be. Now, as I said, this image has historical precedence. And we actually see Venus Pudica images that date all the way back to classical period Greece. Now, in this image here, and this is actually the first ever image of Venus Pudica in art, we are seeing Aphrodite. And before her hand broke off, she's making this kind of half-hearted attempt to shield the pubic region here. And so she was making this half-hearted attempt to kind of shield herself as a sense of modesty. The other thing about Venus Pudica that indicates a sense of modesty is that she's looking away from the viewer, as though she's modest or perhaps she's embarrassed that she's being looked at while she is nude. So it's the half-hearted blocking of the genitalia, the looking away as well. And we see this happening in both of these images. Now there's one other term I think that's important to define. It's a term we're going to come across a lot more in the later parts of this class. And this term is pastoral landscape. A pastoral landscape is where you see man and nature sort of in harmony. As harmonious as it's going to get, the best relationship that man could have with nature, pastoral landscape. So it's this idea that man is in harmony with nature, man is not dominating nature, he's not damaging nature, man and nature are one. The way in which we see pastoral landscape being represented in this painting are in a couple of ways. First of all, the landscape itself is extremely peaceful. We see these beautiful rolling hills, there's some lovely mountain outcroppings in the back, dramatic sky with some really fascinating cloud formations. Everything is really picturesque, and nature is presented in this very ideal way. There's not really anything we could see if we looked around that seemed to be a flaw within nature or some sort of negative feature of nature. Like there's no storm or anything like that. The presence of man we see with the buildings and of course with the female figure. These very nicely integrate into the landscape visually. Giorgione uses a similar color scheme and even some similar shapes with the kind of sort of flat shapes and like diagonal lines here. You can see replicated back here in the painting. And so there's a visual integration between man and nature, and you can argue that these really don't dominate the landscape, they're not damaging it, it's just man and nature coinciding. Man and his relationship with nature are perfect. Another way, though, that you can see pastoral landscape is visual similarities between the body of this woman and the forms of the landscape. A somewhat similar usage of color scheme in terms of tone, these like yellows and brown tones, but even just kind of like the undulation of form, the swell of the breasts and the belly and the legs, kind of mimics the swell of the hilly landscape behind the figure. Another way that we see visual integration between man and nature. A pastoral landscape, nature is most beautiful, man in the best possible relationship that he can have with nature. Nature and man are almost like one in this really beautiful and harmonious way. Now, many art historians theorize that Giorgione did not actually finish this piece, that he actually passed away before he finished this piece, and it was finished by his student Titian. And if you look at this piece by Titian, you can certainly see that there is a familiarity that Titian has with Sleeping Venus, and that there may have been a very strong influence on his mentor Giorgione on Titian's work. This is practically the same painting as Sleeping Venus, except we have the female nude presented in a slightly different way. Of course, we have the lack of a pastoral landscape here because the scene is indoors, but we do have that Venus Pudica theme with the attempt at modesty. Now, this is a little bit of a different attempt at modesty because we do have the kind of half-hearted blocking of the genitalia. But unlike Sleeping Venus, this Venus, Venus of Urbino, she directly meets the viewer's gaze. Now, she kind of tilts her head, which may kind of be this sort of coy play at modesty, but it still is a little bit more bold in that clearly there's some sexuality being presented, and she is acknowledging that the viewer is looking at that presentation. So she knows that she's being sexualized by the viewer's gaze, and she is very coyly, oh, you know, I'm modest, but really kind of seeming permissive that it's okay to look and to appreciate what you see. We have at the foot of her bed a dog. Dogs very often in art, here's a little iconographical analysis, are symbolized as a sexual symbol. The idea maybe of sexuality is more of our like animal or instinctual urges. And maybe because the dog is sleeping, it's this idea that the sexual urges are there, but maybe not at this particular moment. Like our Giorgione piece, we have a beautiful and deep, rich use of color. We have that beautiful sensuality in the languid laying out form of this new female, in addition to the more sensual use of color. There is some ambiguity seen right in here. What's happening? Who are these people? What's this girl trying to get into? And art historians really do not have a definitive answer. We have some theories, but no definitive answer as to what is going on here. So our typical Venetian style ambiguity. Now, what's interesting about the Venus of Urbino is that we are looking at a painting of a courtesan, a prostitute. And this was a prostitute that frequented the bedroom of the Duke of Urbino. And this is why it's called Venus of Urbino. And this painting was commissioned by the Duke of Urbino to be painted by Titian, a sexualized, alluring, very teasing image of the Duke's favorite courtesan, which he had this painting hung directly across from his bed, so he could look at this painting while he's laying in bed. And I think that you can kind of do the math and figure out what would happen from here on out. We'll look at this painting again a little bit later in the semester. It will resurface when we begin to look at Impressionism.